First Timothy tonight. For those who will be joining us on Facebook, um, apologize for being late, but I actually completely forgot that we were having business meeting tonight and forgot to put that in my. I had all my stuff ready for it, but I was not ready when I made my Facebook post. So appreciate you sticking around. And if you are joining us tonight, we welcome you. We're going to be back again into the book of First Timothy. And last week, we kind of started on verse 11 of First Timothy. But I want you tonight to look back, if you will, to the book of First Timothy, chapter 5, and I want to begin reading tonight in verse number 9. And I'm going to read back down through 11 to bring us right back to where we left off last week. Um, Verse 9 begins and says, y'all excuse me, I'm not in the right place. Okay, First Timothy 5, chapter 9, begins tonight and says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry." Now, if you remember, for the last couple of weeks, we have been looking at the biblical idea here of, and I only use this term because it helps people understand. We have been looking at the idea of welfare from the church that is being provided to these widows. And these widows, we found, were all over 60 years of age. Okay. And the church, even for those over 60 years of age, laid out specifics. And just to sum it up and make it as easy as I could, if you weren't listening, I didn't get to hear the last ones, it basically said that the church was willing to take on caring for these widows over 60 if these were women who had supported the church their whole lives. That's what it really comes down to. It did not, and folks, don't take that to mean, well, if they tithed all their life, now we're gonna, since they've been giving us money, we're gonna give some back. Never spoke anywhere about finances, and this is really not speaking about finances. This is not about these widow women receiving a check every month to live on. It's about the church feeding them, clothing them, caring for them, because they are left with nothing in many situations. As I said, in Jesus' day, we didn't have 401ks and pension plans. When the husband died, if he was the sole provider, most women had no job at all at that time. And so they lost everything. And for those women who had given their life to the service in the church is going to give back to them. And then come to verse 11, where it begins to at least sound bad when you read it. It says, "Do not do this for the younger widows, those who are under 60. And in verse 11, it says, the reason is, when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. So, Paul here begins to make a case that these younger widows are to be treated differently. Now, folks, here's something you need to understand. This is not saying do not help widows under 60. I told you that it's very possible, and a lot of theologians believe, that these older widows that it spoke of first, many of them were serving in very important roles in the church, and they had decided when they were left single that they would just give the rest of their time to the church. In other words, they were not going to remarry. And at the age of 60 back then, a woman was considered that she had given her life service because she had raised a family and been a godly mother and a godly church member, and thus she was, quote, retired, if you will. But for those under 60, we're going to see that what happens here is Paul begins to tell us that he is more concerned about their spiritual lives than he is their physical ones. And much of what Paul is going to teach us here is that his greatest concern for these younger widows was their souls and their actual spiritual lives. Now, what is strange here, Paul actually begins to make a case here that it would be better for these women under 60 to remarry than to be cared for by the church. Now, some might say, why would he do that? Now, we're not going to get to cover a lot tonight because there's a lot I'm going to go through on this because we're going to take a big, broad look at this, mainly because I want to cover all aspects of it. And I want people to be clear and understand what's going on here. Why would Paul say that it is better for these younger widows to remarry than to be cared for by the church? To me, this is actually pretty simple. I could stop after I say this and just move on. I'm not going to because there's a lot I want to cover related to this. Paul's looking at these younger women and says that it is almost always better for them to remarry. And the reason it's better for them to remarry is the same reason that it's better for people to get married in the first place. And here's what that is: sexual desires. Sounds nasty or sleazy or whatever. Folks, we're sexual beings, okay? And sex is not a dirty word. It is a beautiful thing. God created it, God ordained it. God put Adam and Eve together, and immediately they had a sexual relationship because that's how you produce children. God has told everyone, go forth and multiply. The only way humans multiply is through sexual intimacy. So Paul here has taught us earlier on in the Bible, before we get to 1 Timothy, that a person should only seek to live single and celibate, okay, if they are completely able to deny their sexual desires. Quite simply, here's the way Paul basically summed it up. Paul basically said the only time it's a good thing for a person to not be married is if they are able to completely put away any sexual desires they have for the opposite sex. In other words, if a man is able to have no desire to have sexual relations with a woman, Paul said that would be a great thing for the ministry. And I've told you before, Paul is right. We looked at this, we've studied this in depth in the past here. Paul basically said this: if a guy was able to become the pastor of a church and had no immediate family ties to concern him, he had no wife and he had no children, he could do an incredible job being a pastor because he has absolutely nothing to hinder him. A lot of church members now grow up thinking that the pastor should be that way anyway. I'm going to tell you, that's not right, and it's impossible. How many pastors have come and gone through the church and burn out because their people believed that whatever their wife and children wanted should come, you just do that when you get around to it. You serve us first, and you don't, and they're way in the back somewhere. Listen, that's not the way the Bible teaches this. A pastor's first concerns got to be the people that live under his house with him. It has to be. They have to be equal with his church members at an absolute minimum. And there is no question. There's not a man in the world who probably couldn't do. I want you to think you could do anything the Lord called you to do without a second thought. You know, you could have, if a guy went into ministry and stayed single and had no desire, no sexual desires for women, listen, especially a man, because most men could easily live in 800 square feet if they got a big enough garage to put their boat in, right? I mean, we're just being honest here, all right? I mean, all they really need is a square that's big enough so that they can get the biggest TV size they can get and a bathroom and a kitchen. That's it. That's about it. They can just sleep in the floor, on the couch, whatever. Very few men are looking for all that luxury to begin with. And so, thus, if God wanted to draw them off to Arizona, they could just sell that little place and go. They don't have to think about their kids at their school. They don't have to think about their wife. They think about nothing but the church and their ministry. But Paul also said the only way a man should try that is if he does not burn, as Paul used the word, if he does not burn with lust. Now, when Paul was saying that word lust there, I view that word lust differently than we view it many times. Because I think what Paul was basically saying is that if a man can live his life and be happy without having a woman in his life, that's great. But if he can't, he needs to get married. I believe Paul here is basically teaching pretty much the exact same thing to these younger widows. Uh, the reason that we're going to take a pretty big walk on this is this church knows, and anybody that's ever listened to me knows, that, I don't like to take 2, 3 verses out of any chapter and say, well, here it is, especially when the Bible covers this same subject in a lot of different ways. So I don't like cherry picking. I've gave you before a simple view that I heard. I have no idea where I heard it, when I heard it. All I know is it's been floating around in my head and it's written in one of my Bibles and has been for many years. I'd love to give somebody credit for it, but I don't have any idea where I got it. But I've tried to take this, and if you will, to kind of make it a good theme for being a pastor. And here it is. Do not forbid what the Bible permits. And yet, do not permit what the Bible forbids. Okay? Now, you've heard me say this before. I think if you went back 150 years, you're going to find that the church would fall on the side that when it was guilty, that's because it was many times forbidding something that the Bible did not forbid. Men and women did, the Bible didn't. But now in the world we live in, I think it's turned completely around because today the bigger problem in many churches is that they have begun to permit things that the Bible forbids. Okay. So clearly here, Paul is making the assumption that most of these younger widows are going to remarry. And Paul does not forbid that, and he does not discourage them remarrying. And it's very easy for me to prove that to you because all you have to do is we jump out ahead just a little bit, come down to chapter 5, verse 14. Here, coming from this same passage, Paul says this, therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Now, you can't get more clear here that Paul says, I desire to see these young widows remarry. Up there where it talks about them in verse 11, begun to grow wanton against Christ, There's a lot of different theories on exactly what that means. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of all of them in a certain way so that you can kind of see how this begins to make sense. Paul here is obviously concerned with the possibility that these younger widows might fall into a trap of Satan's. That's clear. And if we think back to this time, we go back to Paul's day when a younger woman, and let's remember, every time I say younger woman, I think we start thinking 25. Let's remember, this is a category 60 and under. Okay. So it's not necessarily, just 25-year-old widows. Let's remember something else. A lot of people got married back then when they were 14 or 15. So we could be speaking about 16-year-old girls here and 59-year-old women, if you will, both of whom were widowed. And Paul it almost felt like to me that, like, if Paul had asked my advice, I'd have said, well, let's have three categories. Let's go from 40 to 60 and then another one under that. But Paul here is saying, nope, 59 to 15, if you will, is good enough. Here's what happened to all of those women, including a 59-year-old woman. Back in those times, when they lost their husband, they lost, if you will, everything. Because, especially at that time, women either were not allowed to or did not work. A woman's job at that time, which is, here I say this again last week, there ain't nothing wrong with what a woman's job was back then. It stayed that way for thousands of years, and most women lived their lives happily. There is nothing wrong with a woman who says, I want to be a stay at home mom. I want to stay home and raise the kids. My husband will go to work, and I'm going to be a homemaker, because they are making homes. Husbands are building the houses, the wives are making it into a home. That is a godly and amazing thing. Okay? I don't like the world we live in today, which tries to turn that into a negative. It's ridiculous. But when she lost her husband, she probably lost all of her income. And not only that, but she lost her God given protector, if you will. I mean, the man back then was the protector of the home. He brought the money home from his job, if you will. And the wife took all of that and made a home out of it. Now you take that away, and all of a sudden she's on her own. And it seems Paul clearly understood that this could easily lead her to make a very rash and a very foolish decision in two different ways. The first one was, by all appearances here, some of these younger widows, as soon as they were widowed, made a vow that may have been very similar to what these 60-year-old plus widows were doing. In other words, they said, I'm not going to remarry again. I'm just going to dedicate my life to the church and to the service of God through the church. Now, Paul would not say, oh, you can't do that. Paul is saying you better think twice before you do that. Why? Obviously, it's because Paul said that's an easy vow to make, a much harder one to keep. Now, folks, in this situation, I want you to understand, we're hearing this from an absolute authority on the subject, because Paul is living his life single and celibate, because he is doing nothing but traveling the world preaching the gospel to anybody that will listen to it. He is doing it. And I believe what we're seeing here is Paul is basically saying this. Let me tell you something, ladies. You better think real hard before you do it, because I can tell you from experience that it is not easy. As I said, there is no reason for us to try to, pretend things are not true. The truth is, when someone is young in particular and they wind up by themselves, they might look at the church and say, I'm just if it's a man, he might say, I'm not going to marry again. I'm just going to, I'm going to put all my energy into the church. And a woman might say the same thing. And Paul is telling both of them, most likely you won't be able to resist having someone else in your life. Now, let's remember, Paul is not saying that's a bad thing because he just said, in my opinion, you should get remarried. So Paul is not saying don't remarry. Paul is saying before you make some kind of vows or before the church, because here's why, folks. There's got to be the discussion that we just came out of is related to this. This didn't just pop up. Remember, we looked at the idea of which women would qualify to be completely cared for by the church after they were over 60. And Paul is basically saying, I believe to the church, it's not going to be a good idea for you to start taking on all the rest of these younger women because whatever vow they're going to make here, most of them are not going to be able to keep it. And Paul is not trying to say that in a negative way. He's trying to say it because it's reality. Uh, with my little tease tonight on the Facebook page, and unfortunately, because we had business meeting, we're not going to get all the way there tonight. But I teased the idea that I'm basically going to be walking on broken glass and fire pits as we go through this subject because there's going to be a lot of sexism that's going to come up through it. And today in 2021, a lot of people are going to say this whole passage is irrelevant. Well, no, it isn't. It was relevant when it was written, and it's relevant now. And not a single thing has changed. Here's the truth. Paul also knew this. We have seen this in other places. Paul understood that these younger women, now left alone, all by themselves, to fend off the whole world, could easily fall victim to his greatest nemesis, which is the false teacher. The false teacher who comes in and starts to tell them, folks, there are people today who have built their church completely on the ideas of everything that they're going to do out in the community. And when the man finally gets in the pulpit, he sits up there and doesn't even need the Bible. It's more of a club, a welfare club, if you will. And when I say welfare, I'm not saying that negative. I'm saying there are churches who do a fantastic job at feeding people and running clothing ministries and all the rest of this stuff. All of that's awesome. But the minute their preacher gets up and preaches false doctrine, that church is useless in the kingdom of God. It's pretty clear. Jesus said, those who give a cup of water in my name are being praised in heaven. But that he also made it clear that you can cast out demons in some other name and die and go to hell. Paul realizes just how difficult it would be here for a young widow. And folks, I'm going to add to this because this is 2021. And there are things that are reality. So if we're going to look at the subject of young widows here, we're going to have to also look at the subject of young divorcees because, folks, in 2021, it is much more likely for a younger woman to be divorced than it is to be widowed. Not impossible, obviously, but divorce was around in Paul's day. We've looked at it. Jesus spoke about it. I remember I spent 3 sermons on it, and it was one of the most difficult things I've ever done because Jesus did not give a positive view of it. But it is the reality of the church we live in today that many young people get divorced. And here's what we're going to see as we go into next week, and I might as well stop here because I can't get anything else tonight. In the end, what we're going to find is that Paul's teaching on this idea of how difficult it is for someone who's now left all alone to be able to just swear off their sexual desires and just serve the church applies to women and to men. And we're going to see that it doesn't matter. It's the same both ways. And I'm going to say this um, because it appears to me that there's no way to avoid this either. Folks, when we look at what has happened in the last 10 years in the Catholic Church with priests who have sworn, I'll live my life celibate, and you know what we have found? We found out just how many of them have been unable to. And if you take the last 20 years and go into the rest of the Christian church, you're going to find that a lot of men have been married and still can't live celibate because they have cheated on the wife that they married. And so, if it's that hard for people to be celibate in a marriage, imagine how hard it is for a person to wind up on their own at, let's just say, the age of 25, wind up on their own, and then resist their natural God given desires for the rest of their life. It is going to be difficult. And so next week, when we come back, we will build on this. I teased this a little bit with the idea of speaking about mixed marriages. We're going to. Just don't try to outsmart the preacher. Y'all know I can be a little tricky. And so when I speak of mixed marriages, you need to think biblically of that. Let me just say that what you may have grown up with in your life being called a mixed marriage is not what the New Testament refers to as mixed marriages. Paul is concerned these widows are going to wind up getting into mixed marriages. And next week we will pick up and we're going to see exactly what he means by that. Thank you for joining me, Facebook folks. Thank you for joining us, even those of you that joined us late. We did have business meeting tonight. Thankful for the church and wonderful business meeting. We'll be back next week and we'll have our full time for our sermon time. Would you join me in a word of prayer as we close? Father God, we come tonight here right in the middle of another difficult and sometimes challenging text. Lord, it's much easier to look back and understand exactly who Paul was talking to in those situations than it is to kind of try to relate it to our situations today, because in many ways it's totally different. And yet, at the core of it, the simple teaching of the Bible is always the same. And Lord, I know the church has at times turned sex and any kind of talk of it into this taboo that we don't mention. And yet the Bible speaks of it a lot, and Paul's speaking of it here and showing us not a dirty thing about it, but just a reality of it. And so, Lord, I just pray that we as Christians would be people of reality and we'll deal with passages for what they really are and come to see that they're given for our benefit. And the only thing Paul wants to do with these younger widows is to show them what is best for them. And Lord, what's best for them is best for us almost all the time. Lord, we love you tonight. We praise you and we thank you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you, folks. Thanks for coming, church. Thanks, Facebook friends. See you Sunday morning at 11.